The Democratic Republic of the Congo today is a large and unwieldy state. It has become known as one of the most impoverished and unstable states in an already impoverished and unstable region. Decades of poor leadership and ethnic conflict have contributed to this stagnation and left the country with an inability to rise above its circumstances. The issues faced by the Congo have been further compounded by the country's geography. Aside from its sheer size, the majority of the country is comprised of the Congo River Basin rainforest, whose climate and lacking development makes the area highly prone to disease outbreaks. The majority of the country's mineral wealth is also concentrated in the far-off southeastern portions of it, a region with a more mild climate and manageable landscape, all of which has led locals of the area to feel as though the rest of the country is holding them back. Naturally, many have questioned the continued existence of the Congo given that its arbitrary colonial borders and sheer size seem to hinder development in many areas of the country, and in fact it did once seem that the Congo would break up, when several regions seceded from the nation during an event known as the Congo Crisis. The secession movements were challenged when the Army Chief of Staff Joseph Mobutu seized power and unified much of the Congolese army. The breakaway regions were pulled back into the fold of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, with Katanga in the southeast being the last to be reintegrated. With the help of UN forces, the region would be brought under Mobutu's control, initiating a 3-decade-long dictatorship during which time the Congo became known as the Republic of Zaire. With that, the Congo remained a unified geographic entity, albeit with several civil wars and rebellions for state control between then and now. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline, the Congo was divided? Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another alternate history scenario for you, and if you're new to the channel, welcome. We have videos like this every week, so stay tuned. Before we go any further, I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone who's donated to us on Patreon, Utreon, and right here on YouTube through channel memberships. Your donations really go a long way to keeping this channel going, and by donating to us across any of these platforms, you'll get access to some great perks including physical merch, a custom designed flag wallpaper, and access to an exclusive members-only Discord server where you can enter your scenarios for a chance to have them made into full videos. You can follow the pop-up on screen here, go to the comments section or description to visit any of these pages and support our channel, and of course you can do so by clicking the join button right below this video. If you can't donate anything, consider subscribing and sharing this video to help the channel out. Now, back to the video. The Congo itself has long been a region of conflict, albeit on a much smaller scale, as local tribes fail to become sizable due to a lack of infrastructure, lacking agriculture, and the prevalence of disease. That is, aside from the Congo Kingdom on the coast and the more inland southern states that resided in the far less forested and more hospitable southeast. Within these states, power was organized into what can be equated to a feudal model, with a capital exercising power on surrounding chiefs who acted as local leaders. Within the Congo Kingdom specifically, there was a complex hierarchy of brutal local leadership. Meanwhile, in the southeast, the Luba-Lunda states emerged, with some similar feudal government structures between them and the Kingdom of the Congo. However, these states differed significantly from the Congo Kingdom in terms of their systems of justice and punishment, with crimes against the whole community seeing heavy punishments such as execution or exile, whilst those against individuals focused on restoring any wrongs committed, which allowed tight-knit and strong communities to form in the area leading up to the 19th century. In the 19th century, the dynamics of sub-Saharan Africa would see significant change. At the time, these regions had long-held relationships with several European powers, with many engaging in the trade of ivory, gold, and slaves, with the Europeans who only held a few coastal forts at the time. But it would be with the discovery of quinine that the Europeans would be able to enter the continent's interior, thus beginning the scramble for Africa, with the European powers using their superior arms, tactics, and sometimes negotiations to take over the continent's interior. Initially, several wars broke out over disputed claims on the continent, which led Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of the newly formed German Empire, to call for a conference to settle disputes and set up rules for colonial governance. During this conference, most of the borders of modern Africa were solidified as the continent was partitioned. However, one stretch of land known simply as the Congo became an area of significant dispute in the negotiations. The Congo being a vast area was eyed by many of the European powers, however it would be Belgium's King Leopold II that would gain the territory as a compromise between the great powers. This territory, however, would not be under the government of any nation, but instead the direct property of King Leopold II, who during his rule would impose the same brutal codes of the old Congo Kingdom into the whole of the Congo. This led to calls by the international community for the Belgian government to annex the Congo and remove it from Leopold's control, which they would eventually do in 1908, both to settle the outcry and to gain it as a more direct source of revenue for the Belgian government. Following the two world wars, the Congo would begin to see calls for independence. Independence movements would really take off in the 1950s after reforms were introduced in the neighboring French colonies. This movement would largely be pushed by a growing middle class of westernized Africans who were both wealthier and better educated than their lower class counterparts. While largely nationalist in their ideology, these movements differed to a significant degree on economic policy, but the desire to remove Belgian colonial rule largely unified them into a single front. Throughout the 1950s, the Congo would become embroiled in protests and riots. As sentiments swelled, the Belgian government realized that they could no longer maintain control and so invited the various nationalist groups for a conference in Brussels. Thus, the Congo gained its independence on June 30th of 1960. Immediately following independence, two major parties would emerge. The first was the Congolese National Movement, or MNC, led by Patrice Lumumba, who was one of the primary drivers behind pan-Congolese nationalism and the broader independence movement. The party supported a strong centralized government and direct control of the country's economy, which aligned it a good deal with the Soviet Union. The second faction was the Alliance of the Bakongo, also known as ABAKO. It was led by Joseph Mobutu. While also a nationalist party, was of a more regionalist variety that sought to increase the autonomy of the Congo people, protect their rights, and generally adopt a federalized system of government. These two parties formed a coalition in order to create a majority government. However, the deep divides between their goals quickly led to infighting. The spark of the conflict would be an army mutiny in Leopoldville 5 days after independence, which forced Belgian paratroopers to intervene to protect Belgian nationals being targeted by the Africans. This increased tensions between the MNC and ABAKO, the two clashing over the Belgian intervention. Following this, on July 11th, Katanga in the southeastern Congo declared its independence, with the Belgian government supporting the group, further adding to the chaos. On September 5th, Kasavubu dismissed Lumumba from his position as prime minister, leading the MNC to declare the new ABAKO government illegitimate. An ally of Lumumba soon declared himself prime minister of a new government that took an even more overt left-wing stance. The country would descend into civil war as several regions sought independence and others fought for control of the national government in what came to be known as the Congo Crisis. Lumumba, who had initially been put under house arrest, would later flee and head towards Stanleyville in the east, where he expected to rally support, but he was pursued by troops loyal to the Army Chief of Staff Joseph Mobutu, who had unified the army under his control, effectively taking control of the country. America largely supported Mobutu over Lumumba, which allowed him to gain significant military support from the United Nations. Lumumba would be captured, unable to properly rally the entire base of the MNC, and would be executed soon after. With all opposition removed, Mobutu would go about reunifying the Congo with the support of the United Nations, but this time, things are different. It was the death of Lumumba that allowed the United Nations to coalesce around Mobutu, and it was Mobutu's control of the army which allowed for a unified front to form. For the sake of the scenario, let's suppose that Mobutu is unable to capture Lumumba and instead dies in a failed coup attempt, which allows Lumumba to maintain control of the areas of the nation he had, leaving the country militarily divided. The effect of Lumumba remaining alive would mean that his left-wing rival government would maintain far more legitimacy. The MNC could be expected to take over much of the northern Congo where they had previously found the greatest amount of support. However, the capital of Leopoldville and much of the country's west near the mouth of the Congo River would remain under an ABAKO government. The MNC would find a steady foreign sponsor in the form of the Soviet Union, given that they, in our own timeline, supported Lumumba's government. This would allow the MNC to maintain a stable front line and potentially make gains against the other breakaway states. However, with the United States continuing to view Lumumba as a threat, support for ABAKO, Katanga, and South Kasai would be increased as a check against growing communist influence within the North Congo. Support from America alongside Belgium, Portugal, Rhodesia, South Africa, and others would lead the war to stall, and with America involving itself on the side of the anti-communist states, the United Nations would likely not intervene, especially given that interest would be split within the permanent states of the UN Security Council. Eventually, borders would stabilize along several frontiers, roughly aligning to the geography and ethnography of the area, and see a ceasefire in 1965, around when the Congo Crisis ended in our own timeline. In the north of the country, the MNC would maintain control of what we'll refer to as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, largely backed by a combination of minority tribes and devoted left-wingers, all propped up by the Soviet Union. The state itself would adopt a position of Pan-Africanism, but would see the greatest degree of power concentrated within the hands of its eastern Swahili populations. Meanwhile, the South Congo would be divided into three countries. In the west, where the Congo River empties into the Atlantic, we would see the emergence of a Congo Republic based around ethnic Congolese nationalism. This republic would be led by the remnants of ABAKO and focus on self-sufficiency and market-oriented economics. However, given the history of the region and the pre-existing government infrastructure it would inherit, it would very likely suffer from severe corruption, hampering its development. In the central south, another state known as South Kasai would emerge. South Kasai seceded similarly to Katanga, albeit without as much international support. But in this timeline with the communists in the north, South Kasai would benefit from increased aid from the Western powers. South Kasai in our own timeline was largely led by the Luba people, and so would likely see an identity develop around the Luba culture. South Kasai may face coups and rebellions spurred on by ideological disagreements and lingering tribal divides among the Luba, but nonetheless South Kasai would remain backed by the Western powers as a buffer against communist expansion in sub-Saharan Africa. The final country that would emerge from the ashes of the Congo would be Katanga in the mineral-rich and wealthy southeast of the Congo. In our own timeline, Katanga had the highest chance of any breakaway state of achieving full independence, with it having the backing of several European governments and investors. Katanga also benefited from relatively competent leadership under its first president, a native African who had become a wealthy mining magnate that supported the regional autonomy of Katanga prior to the Civil War. In this alternate timeline, Katanga, primarily made up of the Lunda people, would experience a similar economic miracle to that of Botswana, with the nation's mineral wealth being leveraged to attract European investors and expand local infrastructure and education. Given the fact that Katanga would have been majority Lunda, the pre-existing Lunda culture had provided a tight-knit social bedrock for its population, one that valued individualism while still promoting civic duty, as was exemplified during its short existence in our own timeline. As a result of all of this, Africa's importance in the Cold War may be somewhat elevated in this alternate timeline compared to our own. With a large communist state in the continent's center led by a somewhat capable leader, it could be expected that some of the nearby communist and socialist movements in neighboring countries would be more successful. Uganda, for example, would see a greater divergence from our own timeline. This is because the nation during the 1960s faced communist unrest and agitation from a group known as the Uganda People's Congress. This group in our timeline was fairly unsuccessful, but with the Democratic Republic of the Congo or Communist Congo sharing a border with it, aid could be expected to come to the movement and allow it to see greater success. Tanzania may also see greater communist influence when compared to our own timeline, as the nation fell under the Tanganyika African National Union when it combined with Zanzibar, a nation that had experienced a communist revolution in our own timeline to gain its independence. In our timeline, it officially declared itself a socialist state in 1967, so it's possible that the communist movement may simply burn hotter there, especially given its own pan-African ambitions aligning with those of the Congo. One final nation of note would be Kenya, which in our timeline had aligned with the Soviet Union under the leadership of the Kenyan African National Union in 1963 upon gaining independence. It could be expected that this nation would cooperate with Communist Congo alongside its fellow Swahili neighbors. Given the rich mineral resources of the South Congo and American desires to prevent the further expansion of communism in the area, the United States would almost certainly continue to support the new states just as it had South Korea and Vietnam. While it can't be known if the aid would actually be used effectively in the Congo or Kasai, it is likely to be the case in regard to Katanga, which would have already held stability, resources, and strategies necessary to succeed as a state. Katanga would likely build close relations with its neighbors both during the conflict as it had in our own timeline and following it. Primarily it would seek better relations with South Africa, Portugal, and the Central African Federation, all of which in our own timeline provided support to Katanga. The Central African Federation in our own timeline broke apart into three entities: Malawi, Zambia, and Rhodesia. Zambia would fall under a left-wing African nationalist party known as the United National Independence Party, or UNIP. Meanwhile, Malawi became an anti-colonial and anti-communist power. While the instability and seemingly rise of communism within Africa worried some foreign observers, the American government largely ignored what was occurring due to its peripheral nature to the broader Cold War conflict. However, with Africa playing a far more active role in the Cold War this time around, America may supply Katanga, Malawi, and even Rhodesia with the supplies necessary to overthrow the left-wing UNIP government in Zambia sometime between 1964 and 1970 for the sake of securing a Central African anti-communist bloc. The impact of this would be tremendous, as in the absence of the UNIP government in Zambia, Rhodesia would not have a hostile neighbor to fund and support the insurgencies which ultimately contributed to its collapse. Furthermore, following an intervention by the three surrounding powers, it's likely that much of Zambia would be annexed by Katanga, given the fact that much of the country had significant Luba populations, primarily concentrated in the northwest, while the south of the country may fall under a new government under the supervision of Rhodesia or Malawi, or both depending upon how it was partitioned. Rhodesia following this would likely see recognition from Britain upon the British realizing the futility of demanding majority rule when it had built a stable power base within the region and now had the backing of the United States. I've gone over the effects of Rhodesia surviving as a country in this video here, but to summarize, Southern African politics would have changed dramatically and allowed South Africa and its coalition of anti-communist states to hold Southern Africa as a solid bloc throughout the Cold War. That being said, given demographic pressures, it's likely that conflict would still break out at some later date over majority rule, especially as Katanga and Malawi lessened their need for Rhodesian and South African support and shifted their focus from anti-communism to anti-colonialism. Refocusing our attention back north, a few other developments would have occurred during this time, primarily in the Republic of the Congo, where in 1968 in our own timeline, a military coup turned the nation into a Marxist-Leninist state. In this alternate timeline, however, with the Congo in the west being an anti-communist Bakongo nation-state, it's probable that the Congo would attempt to annex the ethnically Bakongo portions of the Republic of the Congo, not to be confused with any of the several other Congos also mentioned in this video. The result of this would be a new proxy war that, aside from the usual players of the US and USSR, would also see Cuba intervene, just as they had in Angola in our own timeline, attempting to break the growing Western influence within South and Central Africa. But what do you think? What might have happened had the Congo broken up? Would it have been better off? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Mr. Z, out.